This is going to be a brief breakdown of just some of the misconceptions that many people have of Cheikh Anta Diop's scholarship and just a lot of the lies that are being spread about the great elder. And I want to really talk about an accurate conversation that we should be having about the influence of his scholarship and many of the post-Diopian scholars who are continuing his work in the contemporary 21st century society. So there's a lot of misrepresentations of Cheikh Anta Diop's views, and this is going to be an article that Dr. Shamarka Keita wrote for Oxford University. The late Cheikh Anta Diop was perhaps the strongest opponent from Africa of bias in historical scholarship, broadly defined. His work and purpose have been frequently misunderstood and misinterpreted. It is also very likely that his views, or some of them, have been seriously misrepresented. The purpose of this brief essay is to examine, in a preliminary fashion, recent statements or implications about Diop by a team from the University of Michigan and Washington. Diop's work is not defended or refuted. The concern is what Diop really said or did. So many people have accused Diop of so-called inverted racism or reverse racism. They also state that his definition of black or African includes only those with the stereotyped, caricatured West African physiognomy described in some literature as the true Negro, which is sometimes coterminous with the forest Negro and sometimes not. The word Negro, in the sense of denoting a type, a narrow set of traits, is used to connote an erroneous concept of the only real biological African, much as some used to believe that the only real European has the stereotyped Nordic physiognomy, which would greatly reduce the numbers of Europeans or whites. Of course, there never was an entire population spatially or culturally defined, whose individuals all conform to some abstracted Nordic or East Baltic type, well-defined single set of traits. However, Negro, like Nordic, should be understood as denoting one ensemble of traits or anatomical trends in the numerous interconnected populations of Saharo-tropical Africa, or just Africa. The Negro physiognomy has no privileged place in the pantheon of African human variation. It does not define African. Brace et al. Have a monotypic a priori definition of biological Africans. In order to evaluate the claims of the University of Michigan and Washington team, Diop's life and work must be examined. And this is circumscribed here for the reasons of space consideration. Diop must be understood in the context of French and Old World intellectual traditions. The charge of racism is always a serious and is interesting in the light of Brace et al. Calling Rushton a racialist, a term rarely seen in American writing or heard on the American media, and therefore apt to be confusing. The charge that Diop was an inverted racist is countered by the fact that, among others, he was married to a white French woman. Are there any KKK members married to Nigerians? Diop was an internationalist who cited and had great respect for works of various European writers. He made it clear that culture, not race, was his primary interest. Diop never said that blacks were genetically superior, which would be racist, although such sentiments divorced from real power can only be judged morally, and not from the economic, psychological, and physical damage that anti-black racism has actually done. The road to Damascus is very long, and Diop's widow deserves an apology. So a few things here. A lot of the people who accuse Diop of promoting reverse racism or black supremacy, this is foolish considering who he was married to and the plurality of European scholars and writers that he had deep respect for. And also when it comes to the so-called Negroid or Bantoid or Congoid, these many terms that you hear that are used to try to separate, infra-Saharan African populations from ancient Kemi and Kush, they are completely invalid. They are not accurate from an evolutionary perspective. And Diop, in his writings, did not agree with that. And we're going to go into that a little bit further. The opening paragraphs of Brace et al.'s work establish that their piece is a polemic against various writers who contend that the ancient Egyptians, in a greater or lesser degree, were African culturally and black racially. They include Diop in this group and maintain without exception that these writers used black as a designation of what Seligman called the true Negro. Seligman is most identified with the Hamitic hypothesis, a biodeterministic and racist theory of African cultural and biological variation. It is important to know that in this time of heightened awareness about racism and anti-Semitism, that Seligman became a German citizen under the Nazis. His book became the biological and cultural taxonomic work on Africa. Seligman conceptualized the Hamites, a group whose eastern branch included Nubians, Somalis, and ancient Egyptians, Oromos, and others, as ultimately having come from Asia. He admitted, however, that other competent workers view them as Africans, which can be taken to mean that their microevolutionary history was in Africa. Seligman believed the Hamites to be brown-black pastoral Europeans with superior intelligence of genetic origin. Other European scholars place the Hamites in biological history as the African ancestors of some or most Europeans. These views could not be more diametrically opposed, although they both shared an opprobrium against those regarded as real Negroes. The MW team does not represent a scientific survey of the opinions of the accused writers, nor do they provide a discourse analysis of Diop's work. This is a major failure of the MW piece. It has numerous others that flow from the erroneous underlying belief that a phenogram can simultaneously define an African and unravel microevolutionary relationships. This is a philosophy of science issue here that relates to the flaws of positivism and phonetic taxonomy. The NW team does not offer competing explanations for the result of their work. They do not review the critiques of phonetic taxonomy. These are serious flaws for a piece in a journal that traditionally handles authoritative review pieces. For example, the NW team explains a clustering of certain cranial series with ones from Europe as being the result of gene flow migration from Europe without discussing the more likely explanation that the biological characters responsible for the similarity are the results of convergence or chance. This is Seligmanish and non-evolutionary. The narrow noses and faces of Somali, Nubians, and pre-dynastic Egyptians are a part of the African natural range of variation. Again, this speaks to all of those who bank on the so-called Negroid, Congoid, Sudanid, Saharid, Ethiopoid, Bantoid, and all of these different phonetic, taxonomic classifications. These do not deal with evolution. They are not evolutionary. They're not based upon cladistics. They cannot define the historical dynamics of different populations because each and every one of these populations has the ability to evolve a variety of different traits with respect to geo-environmental conditions. Another example is that of the origins of Egyptian writing. Brace et al. Opt for a Near Eastern origin without indicating that most serious scholars in the 1980s and 1990s rightfully believe in and can demonstrate an in situ development in the Nile Valley. This is the majority opinion. Incidentally, some anthropologists, specifically Sergi and Grafted-Ellie and Smith, from the early 20th century would interpret Brace et al.'s results as indicating migration out of Africa because they were dealing with migrationism and diffusionism, monocausal archaeological inferences. In fact, the authors themselves do this, contradicting the main stress of their views at one point. Europeans in this view would be depigmented, cold-adapted, elongated Africans, the term Hirno uses to describe those with the narrow-nosed, narrow-faced trend once called by some Hamitic. Hirno locates groups with the appropriate anatomy early in East Africa. The Gambel's Cave in Kenya and related material have the prototype craniofacial pattern and date back to 11,000 to 9,000 BCE. This indicates that some populations in Africa evolved a narrow nasofacial pattern independently of European or Asian genes. There is no evidence of a mass migration at this time into Africa. In fact, there was movement out of Africa, perhaps corresponding to the spread of so-called Afroasiatic languages into the Near East. And for those of you who know, Afroasiatic is an area of linguistic diffusion. Just because there's some commonalities between these different languages doesn't necessarily mean they're genetically related. They possibly have these relationships by the way of diffusion from historical contact. So there are numerous other problems of balance and interpretation of the MW presentation. However, an in-depth critique is beyond the scope of this essay. Careful review of Diop's statements indicated that he included a range of peoples and phenotypes under the designation Negre, or black. Diop made a point of addressing the characteristics of certain Fulani and Nubian groups as being part of the range of indigenous African traits. Diop also explicitly stated that the Egyptians absorbed whites during the Amradian period, the second pre-dynastic phase, once viewed as the earliest definitive Proto-Egyptian culture. Diop, though he did not express it clearly, thought in terms of biogeography and biohistory for his definitions. Again, his definitions were based upon biogeography and biohistory, and he included the full variation of the African continent in his designation of Negre. Again, it did not follow Seligman's definition of the true Negro. He also defined populations in an ethnic or ethnogeographical fashions. Nile Valley populations absorbed foreign genes, but this did not change their Africanity. Population geneticists speak of gene exchange between populations, but the gene exchange does not alter even their biological concept of the defined populations. And this again is speaking to what I was relaying before about areal diffusion on behalf of linguistics. So again, population geneticists speak of gene exchange between populations, but the exchange does not alter even their biological concept of the defined populations, which has been determined by means other than a list of characteristics. You can't use these Congoid, Bontoid, Niloid, Saharoid, phonetic, taxometric characteristics to define the biological history of the population. In summary, Diop's conception of Africans is more in tune with the concepts of biogeography, microevolution, variation, and adaptation than is the MW's gratuitous labeling as Africans only those with the metric patterns of true Negroes. Sophisticated computers and algorithms do not substitute for sound theory and knowledge of likely population history. Who are the true Caucasians? The Bracetal thesis that Diop was a racist and that he meant by nègre a single ensemble of traits is contradicted and refuted by Diop's life and writings. It is not clear how this was overlooked, but it further underscores the polemical nature of the piece. The peopling of the Nile Valley can be determined using criteria established by Roos to assess whether migration has occurred into an area. Roos emphasizes the importance of multiple lines of evidence, as does Harrison. These include linguistics, archaeology, physical anthropology, and obviously these criteria are the most appropriate for earlier periods in time. Neither is foolproof in and of itself. Furthermore, some sense of probability is required. Roos' criteria are instructive in the Nile Valley case. Linguistically, especially if we're dealing with the Greenbergian school of linguistics, ancient Egyptian is Afro-Asiatic. However, if you're looking at it from the Obenga school, it would be Egypto-African, Black African, Paleo-African, etc., etc. So this language family's origin is African, and most probably from a region south of Egypt. If the bulk of the Nile Valley population was coextensive with the Aegean or Denmark, then ancient Egyptian should have been Indo-European, but it was not even Semitic, which would be more plausible given Egypt's nearness to the Middle East. If it had been Semitic, even that would not necessarily destroy its Africanity. Archaeologically, the northern Nile Valley owes much to the developments in the Sahara and probably the Sudan. Nilotic flora and fauna were well integrated into the belief and cultural systems, including the writing. In situ sociocultural development from pre-dynastic to dynastic period is in evidence. Contrast Carthage of 700 BCE with the Egypt of its time. Carthaginian core gods and symbols were a Levantine import. Of course, after a long period, it could be argued that Carthage became an African variant of Phoenician culture. How long does it take the colonist or his culture to become native? Given that the indigenous peoples in the state of South Africa are now expected to accept the descendants of European settlers as Africans, it is safe to call the Carthaginian society of 300 BCE African. The physical anthropology of the Nile Valley has a long history of study. Are the early populations of the Nile Valley coextensive with other groups in Africa on a biological level? The answer is yes. Reviews of metric, non-metric, and morphological studies of early southern Egyptian crania reveal that their strongest ties are with the groups south of Egypt. The line proportions are those of tropical people. This is not trivial considering Bracetal's attempt to dismiss it by bringing up the irrelevancy of the line proportions of South Indians and Australian Aborigines. These peoples do not live in Africa, nor do they speak African languages. Line proportions have been shown to be broadly correlated with climate. Allen's rule is the name given to this observation. Jacobs, after establishing the timing of cold adaptation in northern Europe, has used line ratios to help assess migration. Most certainly, the purported flow of northern European genes into the Nile Valley and into Somalia should have altered line proportions at the northern port of entry. Instead, line ratios are supertropical. In fact, the line proportions of early modern humans in Europe are those of heat-adapted peoples. They became cold-adapted by the end of the Mesolithic. The line proportions of Epipaleolithic or Late Stone Age remains from the Nile Valley are tropically adapted. Likewise are those of pre-dynastic Egyptians mentioned by the MWT. Egypt is not in tropical Africa. The gene flow or migration from Europe at the scale suggested by the MW team is not supported by the data or sound models. The amount of migration suggested at the time implied between the Epipaleolithic and Neolithic to pre-dynastic to transit what they call trivially adapted neutral traits is not likely, because the number of generations required will not fit into the temporal gap. Most do not believe these traits to be neutral, a point not discussed by the NW team. A direct comparison of their dendrogram with those from DNA studies reveals that they are not the same. Interpretive sophistry will not resolve the incongruence. As noted earlier, the adjunctive data does not support massive penetrations of the Nile Valley Horn axis by European migrants. These ancient colonists and colonialists did not exist. The ancient Egyptians were bioculturally African. Authentic biocultural Africans are heterogeneous. In the popular discussions about Egyptian origins in the last 10 years or so, it must be noted that one source of conflict is a difference in perception about what black means. In the United States, 19th century law in some southern states essentially made having known African ancestors as a definition of Negro, colored, or black. Law became social custom such that the politically defined Afro-American group is biologically heterogeneous. Currently, Afro-Americans are moving towards developing a codified ethnicity, self-defined group identity with formalized traditions. Afro-American laypersons tend to want congruence between definitions from social life and social science. Most certainly, if mixed meaning hybrid of any time depth equals black, then Egyptians of old were black. Even Kuhn in 1965 conceptualized the Nile Valley's inhabitants as ancient hybrids with obvious indigenous African elements. If mixed becomes definable by serogenetic studies, then this is even more so. However, color terms should not be used as ethnic terms. Serious scholars can study human biogeography by formal means and with approaches in theory divorced from the politics of the social world. However, this seems to be difficult for some. Following the practice of biogeography in the neo-Darwinism of the modern synthesis allows us to interpret biological diversity in Africa as primarily the result of microevolutionary in situ differentiation from an African ancestral group. Therefore, biological non-Africans come into being after the regional differences have emerged post-emigration from Africa. This means that African variation is immense and will overlap with outsiders. Africa here means the entire continent, as it always should. Even some scholars of the Out of Africa school of modern human origins fail to connect the Africans of today with those of the deep past. Is this the result of never posing the question, or something else? Furthermore, it is important to note that so-called racial divergence times based on serogenetics or DNA precede the presence of modern people in Europe. Therefore, what is being labeled racial divergence is actually genetic differentiation, probably taking place in Africa. There is no evidence that the bone and soft tissue characteristics used to define races originally, simultaneously, came into being with this genetic differentiation. In effect, these studies deconstruct the race schema commonly used, although many fail to see this. The No Race School has failed to produce new terms or concepts. Sampling is still being done by race. Some of the unique genes of Europeans precede the existence of modern people in Europe, and hence are not European. Bracetal should have clearly stated their bias toward the theory of the multi-regional origin of anatomically modern humans. Descriptive and neutral language should be used to comment on physiognomies of Africa. Hernot's term elongated African represents a breakthrough. Perhaps the word trend should be appended to this. Calling a narrow nose and face complex Caucasian or even Caucasoid implies that the origin of that trait or complex is to be found in some Caucasian homeland. Unless it is known from history, there was a migration, example that perhaps 20,000 Italians settled in Northwest Africa during the Roman times, then local microadaptation and genetic drift should be the first lines of explanation, especially in Africa. Racial labeling of traits is wrong and bad biology. It ignores the concepts of adaptation, variation, and microevolution. The terms Negro, Negroid should be dropped, and with profit, broad African is a better description. This terminology encourages processual evolutionary thinking. Models from biogeography are the most informative. The legacy of ideal typological racial thinking must be buried with other scholastic falsehoods. The concept of a biogeographical, biohistorical, or just a biological African is a more accurate description of African realities. The term Saherotropical variant describes those anatomical trends most likely to be primarily of adaptive microevolutionary origin. Of course, there was gene flow into Africa and into Europe, also from external regions. It is interesting to note that some would abolish paleospecies categories like Homo erectus, yet maintain conceptually the minor distinctions between various African populations that clearly overlap metrically and morphologically and by serogenetic studies. This labeling of various Africans with nominal terms that imply biological non-overlap or genealogical non-relationship and even non-Africanity clearly has its origins in the realm of a biased, socially constructed knowledge. The results of the anthropological version of the Berlin Conference need to be appropriately dismissed. So again, when it comes to these different racial categories that are used to divide African populations, right? Dr. Shamarka Keita called them the anthropological version of the Berlin Conference. This is your Negroid, Congoid, Bontoid, and all of the Niloid, these different terms that people use based upon synchronic linguistic classifications. Dr. Keita says that we should do away with them in his defense of Cheikh Anta Diop. They're not scientific. They imply non-overlap, non-interrelatedness between these different portions of the African continent. And in reality, when Cheikh Anta Diop classified the ancient Remenkimi as Negre or black, he included the full phenotypic diversity of the African continent from a biogeographical and biohistorical perspective. So when honoring, his research, analysis, and scientific methodology, we should drop this, taxometric foolery. No, we are not Congoids or Bontoids. No, we are not so-called tropical Negroids. We exist as a diverse representation of the deep interrelatedness of the African continent, and we should replace these understandings with the true cladistic analysis and biogeography and biohistory promoted by Cheikh Anta Diop, because that is honoring our ancestors. That is continuing the progress of science. Those who don't, these hypocrites who want to call black bad, want to call Negroid bad, but continue to use, the silly Bontoid, Congoid, Negroid, whatever, right? We need to expose them. They are not promoting science. A lot of their work is totally antiquated, and we have to continue to push the truth for future generations.